The New York City rooftop appears in the work of Edward Hopper and John Sloan probably more than any other American artist during the first half of the 20th century. Sloan especially made use of this elevated setting. It factors prominently in more than 24 of his paintings, prints, drawings, many of which are now well known and indeed considered iconic. Both artists made their careers in New York, and their sustained engagement with this particular architectural space roughly coincided temporally, though in general their approaches diverged, with Hopper's starkness and seclusion versus Sloan's gregariousness and figural density being roughly one way. My remarks today arise from a forthcoming exhibition project that explores how the New York City rooftop had its own cultural geography as a real material space, built environment, and its own visual legacy as an imagined or imaginary space. Focus on the rooftop as a relatively unstudied terrain shifts away from the two dominant modes of perceiving the city, the paradigms of verticality emphasizing altitudes, skyscrapers, panoramic vistas, and so on, and horizontality emphasizing squares, shops, thoroughfares at street level. This project looks at the arena between these axes, both as an extension of private domestic space and as a getaway from it. Roofscape, a term that dates to 1891, suggests not just an expanse of roofs, but the aesthetic prospect of such a scene. And the exhibition roughly begins with the advent of that term, exploring how several artists, including George Alt and Martin Lewis and others, treat it as a kind of world unto itself. This paper today focuses on two etchings, one by Hopper and Sloan, and traces a French inflection in their works, an appeal to a certain unexpected Parisian sensibility. I wish to suggest that their engagement with the rooftop as a site was, in these works anyway, informed to some extent by its role in French visual culture and political history. First, Hopper. Following study with William Merritt Chase, Robert Henry, and Kenneth Hayes Miller, the 24-year-old Hopper traveled to Paris in October 1906. He lived with a French family for almost a year before returning to the United States. He immediately began to see Paris in terms of his experience in New York, comparing these two cities, for example, in a letter to his mother soon after his arrival. Paris is a very graceful and beautiful city, almost too formal and sweet to the taste after the raw disorder of New York. Everything seems to have been planned with the purpose of forming a most harmonious whole, which certainly has been done. To quote him, after the commissioner's plan of 1911 set the grid of Manhattan, filling in the city was, as one historian observes, essentially left in private hands. Paris brings into relief for Hopper the fact that there was no centralized city planning in New York, comparable to Baron Haussmann's plan in Paris, making him more attentive to its character. In Paris, he began to paint unassuming and quiet views of the city. He made 2 additional trips there in 1909 and 1910. Of his subsequent works in the United States, Hopper scholar Gail Levin and others have noted the influence in terms of the choice of subject, approach to the construction of space, and paint handling of French Impressionists, particularly Degas and Caillebotte on Hopper. He encountered their work while abroad, the elevated position, distance, angle, cropping, and so forth of Hopper's American Village here, owing much to a painting such as this one by Caillebotte, for example. More, though, than this question of training and awareness of French art or the milieu of Parisian street life generally, this rather well-trodden ground in the literature on Hopper, comparisons are numerous. I'm interested in how a particular facet of the urban environment, one that repeats in Hopper's work, owes a debt to a somewhat different legacy in Paris. Consider Hopper's New York City etching, Housetops, from 1921. It is a work that, in its very title, makes us alert to something besides the interior of the train car, indeed to that specific feature of the city beyond. The roofs, rising chimneys, doorways, and ventilators are framed behind the glass panels for our inspection, but also beckon to the central figure. She turns, gazing through the only open window at the roof immediately opposite, her eyes exactly aligned with the cornice. The locale seems not merely a backdrop, but a point of distinct interest. The etching is reminiscent of a 1906-7 illustration, the standout watercolor that Hopper made for Victor Hugo's book of poems, a sort of verse diary about the 4-month German siege of Paris in September 1870 to January 1871, and the Paris Commune of March to May 1871, and its aftermath, entitled, in translation, usually The Year of Horrors, from 1872. Hopper's project was never published, and not much is known about it other than the 3 surviving would-be illustrations showing street combat. Hopper's watercolor here does not seem to have been based on any particular poem by Hugo, though the first one, November 1870, on the ramparts of Paris at Nightfall, does, as its title suggests, place the narrator in a similarly high nest, surveying an atmosphere imbued with violence. The sunset was a meager bleeding slit, to sample one line. The incorporation of the Republican tricolor flag, as opposed to the red flag favored during the Commune, would seem to situate the work temporally during the siege of Paris, the defense of the city against Prussian forces, though it is doubtful that the goal was primarily historical accuracy on Hopper's part. What most interests me here is how the later work echoes the earlier one in certain ways. Both are bisected by the horizon line, which, in the case of the etching, coincides with the roof line. In each, 2 roughly full-body figures, one male, one female, are positioned along an identical diagonal. The blank bench in the later work is a quasi-substitute for the gray chimney side in the earlier work, with a triangular patch of shading in the lower left, similar to the slope of the red roof with its own interlaced lines. The woman leaning beyond the edge of her perch, the man with head turned down, playing a supporting role and adjacent to an object whose presence seems to hint at that air of mystery particular to Hopper, the gun, the box, 2 objects gesturing to the characters' inscrutable backstories. It's almost as if in the etching there's a sense of longing for the freedom visualized in the watercolor. The flag planter amid similar cork chimneys, a kind of surrogate or alternate self for the woman. The etching's debt to the watercolor seems to tread in this imagining of herself in that role, liberation as bound up in the rooftop. While she sits behind bar-like window slats during the humdrum commute, perhaps, that realm of possibility fleeting and just out of reach. Her counterpart surmounting, conquering, an active agent of change there in the watercolor, a demeanor and triumph expressing the boldly feminist agenda of that early 1870s moment when, across Paris, as one historian has put it, quote, insurgent women enacted, inspired, theorized, and led revolution. In the etching, the segments of the advertising panel above her, divided by hanging straps, are even evocative of the tripartite flag. This is a less legible banner, to be sure, but it is as though she instead exists under the heading of consumerist rituals. For many years, there had already been ads in the poster slots along station walls and inside trains, especially in the so-called card slots placed above riders' heads. F. Louis Moore's 1914 painting relays this prominence of advertising on board the New York subway, it as a variegated spot to rest one's eyes, avoiding fellow passengers in the congested car. The explosion of advertising in the city in the 1920s increasingly penetrated people's lives. Faced with this proliferation, the critic Walter Patch would, for one, in 1928, pit subway advertising designers against the conservative subway art that commercialized public space against avant-garde artists. More generally, between the late 19th century and the Great Depression, as the economy came to rest decisively on consuming, spending became an important ritual in the daily lives of Americans, creating a country where, to quote one scholar, consumption superseded other civic duties. To put it another way, this era was the beginning of an American consumer society that promised liberation through consumption. It is this relationship that the etching seems attuned to, if vaguely. My terms here are perhaps imprecise, but the rooftop harkens back to, or might offer, a way to circumvent or resist the inundation of advertising, intensifying in the 1920s, the promotion of consumption, the overall decrease in political engagement, and so on, or the unique Hopper malaise, if that's the right word, that is rooted in glimpsing a kind of lost world. Hopper, of course, was well versed in the visual strategies of the American advertising industry, working with various agencies as a freelance illustrator for more than 2 decades. Hopper's obfuscation, though, of the commercial panels here telescopes our attention to the rooftop and seems to enhance the reverberation of the earlier watercolor. The specter of American consumerist hegemony serves as a foil to the potent radical example of the figure's French peer. By all accounts, Paris was where Hopper's attention to the rooftop began. While a student, he was a keen observer, writing, "On the roofs, hundreds of pipes and chimney pots stick up in the air, giving the sky a most peculiar appearance." And this interest lived on. Even though he sloughed off his influences to some extent, Hopper's Francophilia, particularly in this decade, was well known. For example, in his first one-man show in 1920, 10 of the 16 paintings that he featured were from France 10 years earlier. None of them sold. Hopper even listed them possibly with an attitude of defiance with French titles rather than English ones. In 1931, the fellow artist Guy Pendubois observed how something about the French appealed to Hopper. He has studied their language and knows their literature to an extent exceedingly rare among Americans. Relatedly, Pendubois went on to comment, Hopper's realities are in the past of his youth. He depicted New York with Paris in mind, as art historians have noted, but the fixation on Paris was part of something deeper, about something more than Hopper's interest in just architecture. An oscillation between these locales was how Hopper generally approached the city, with their different topographies merging in his memory. Painting from memory, as Margaret Iverson observes, quote, allowed a motif to become saturated with unconscious revelry. And it seems to me Hopper specifically reconfigures the rooftop here in New York as a space to imagine possibility, to project longing, to picture frustrated desire. The etching anticipates Hopper's close attention to the rooftop in 3 subsequent watercolors, a medium he took up in 1923, or maybe I should say took up again. This back and forth dynamic of looking from train car to roof, say, is operative here, with the original title of Self-Portrait. Typically, the building is understood as a stand-in for Hopper, as a reference to his physical stature, as a statement about his height. But I wonder if we might consider the watercolor in a slightly different way, that is, as less oriented outward toward the view of the distant skyline, it is rather undifferentiated and unremarkable, than as a privileging of the surface of the foreground as a space of potentiality. If Hopper is identifying with the vantage point of the building, then it looks back at this exposed, even vulnerable or personal expanse. In other words, here is an instance of the artist Koen Bilden spying on the rooftop, the building standing sentinel, monitoring this zone, the artist as bearing witness to life on the roof, even if what constitutes life here seems to just be lengthening shadows and somewhat enigmatic shapes. Hopper created other watercolors of Greenwich Village roofs in the 1920s that, to even in greater extent, showcase the setting not so much as an occasion to view the surrounding city, but it as part of a secluded inner city that was often overlooked. He also later, in the 1950s, produced several paintings that show solitary figures staring out of windows, light pouring in as they face blue sky or buildings not so far away. Office in a small city is the culmination of this impulse, the complex compositional device of a view not just into an interior but back out the other side gives way to the simplified geometric shapes that meet the figure's contemplation. The tanks and vents there become dark voids with golden highlights. The color, too, splashed across the desk where rectangular forms rise, mimicking in miniature the facing elements. Thus, the plane of the desk serves as a kind of microcosm to the rooftop across the street, to be manipulated by the man, like rearranging puzzle pieces or playing with blocks. The implication here is that he experiences real life only secondhand, that it is accessible only as a poor imitation of the world out there. In this way, the painting suggests as much a small life as a small city, the post-war aspirant's corner office doing little to assuage middle-class dissatisfaction and the narrowness of those white-collar managerial fortunes. It is the painting's openness, the unrealistic airiness, no panes of glass, notice, that sharpens his confinement. Up the corporate ladder, he's pressed in. The clean lines of the modernist office building are entrapping. The rooftop becomes then, for Hopper, a way of externalizing inner life, a way of conveying a desire for something not present. Just as Housetops is about something besides the figure observing the lives of others in their apartments aboard the passing train car, Office in a small city is invested with a sense of yearning through the quiet drama of the rooftop, even if the effect of suppressed drives in these works remains, as is so often the case with Hopper, difficult to articulate. The seeds rest in the early Paris watercolor. Such heights with a peculiar appearance, as Hopper put it, are integral to the moods of these works and to Hopper's phantasmatic city. Unlike Hopper, John Sloan did not go abroad to study, as we've mentioned time and again. And unlike Hopper's austere, unpopulated rooftops, Sloan's are usually teeming with bodies, pretty much all have figures. But like Hopper, Sloan's sustained engagement with the rooftop in and around Greenwich Village began about 1906. One of the earliest of these, which I show you here, Roof Summer Night, shows that the tenement rooftop lends itself to both daytime activities, hanging laundry, and nighttime ones, sleeping, to both men and women, to both adults and youths. The possibly lecherousness of the figure at the middle right is often noted. The vertical city is barely apparent, and initially at least, it's somewhat difficult to make sense of the figural positionings, especially the two girls contorted on either side of the foreground woman who's tilted upward. Bodies not only spill onto one another, but across areas that might define one building from another. Discerning where one building ends and another begins is challenging. There's a sense of dislocation and unbounded quality, the recession far into the distance along this plane that seems to challenge the comparative predictability at street level, the regimentation of the grid, calling into question the reliable cross streets and avenues linking space and time at regular intervals. It is as if here there is a haphazard nexus of rooftops that might be traversed, a different kind of mobility or intersectionality or connectivity that fosters different patterns of sociability or asociability, matters of trust and privacy coming into play, and perhaps even different modes of citizenship. It's a space where the ordinary rules don't apply. Another multi-figured nighttime scene, a less conventional rooftop, shares in this sense of testing the imposition of order. In January 1917, John Sloan and 5 co-conspirators, you see them here, including Marcel Duchamp, the artist, there standing opposite at left, scaled the arch in Washington Square Park. There, with cap pistols, balloons, and lanterns, they staged a picnic and issued a document, the Declaration of Independence of Greenwich Village. The episode and etching are wonderfully dissected by Michael Lobel in his recent book on Sloan. He discusses it in light of the formation of the Society of Independent Artists in 1916 and shows Sloan's strong connections to Duchamp and their relationship between art and illustration, among other matters. Still, whether regarded as an anti-establishment political statement or mere prank, it might be worthwhile, I think, to account for certain resonances of the site that, as far as I can tell, have gone overlooked, and which link the episode more forcefully to the context of World War I and to the climate around U.S. intervention. Architect Stanford White consciously modeled the Washington Arch on the Arc de Triomphe in Paris, Napoleon's grand statement to Imperial France. Built in 1892, the Washington Arch replaced a wood and plaster monument from 1889 that commemorated Washington's inauguration as President of the United States. The imperial and martial connotations of triumphal arches in New York City were no small thing in these years. For instance, the bands breaking into the arch and Sloan's etching were created between the construction of 2 other significant arches that commemorated wars, albeit temporarily. The monumental arch, erected to celebrate Admiral George Dewey after the Philippine-American War, was one of the most visible, to quote historian David Brody, public spectacles in support of empire. The festival of militarism that was orchestrated for the occasion, Brodie again, quote, constructed Dewey as a heroic figure on the level of Washington, pairing him as a second George. The Victory Arch of 1919, on the same Madison Square site 20 years later, marked, of course, America's ever-expanding role in international politics after World War I. The point here is that imperialism was very much at issue in relation to triumphal arches in the early decades of the 20th century. They were important symbols of wars of imperial ambition. Additionally, what at least to my knowledge has not been remarked on in relation to their action at the arch is the fact that the sculptures of George Washington on its north side were added much later. Note the presence of the empty pedestals, the plinth there in this 1899 photo looking down Fifth Avenue into the park. The first sculpture, Washington as commander-in-chief, had recently been installed on the East Pier when Sloan and Company ascended the structure in May of 1916. And it was not yet accompanied by the second sculpture, Washington as president, which was not placed until after their escapade in 1918. In other words, Washington at war, and not Washington at peace, as they are sometimes called, would have been the only sculpture present. Showing Washington exclusively in his general's regalia with sword would have emphasized the military rhetoric of the site. Consider also that when originally laid out in 1826, the square was called Washington Military Parade Ground and used to celebrate the 50th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence. Now, I'm not proposing that Washington was necessarily a lightning rod of anti-imperialism in these years, though his phrases describing the fledgling republic of a rising empire and an infant empire, for instance, do locate the origins of American imperialism in his own time, but rather that the particulars of the site may have mattered. Their action at the arch is typically seen as a test to then-President Woodrow Wilson's ambiguous position about the principles of national self-determination and intervention, and it is, indeed, but it is also a retort to or provocation against political power generally. Their declaration evokes the United States Declaration of Independence of 1776, of course, when colonies debated matters of tyranny and sovereignty already in the midst of war. In January 1916, President Wilson had begun his tour of preparedness speeches pushing the country's defensive needs for a larger army and navy. Patriotic fervor about the war came under the heading of celebrating George Washington's birthday the next month, rendered here in Child Hassam's etching Washington's Birthday, 5th Avenue and 23rd Street, with his characteristic multitude of flags at the same intersection where the Dewey Arch stood and soon the Victory Arch. Directly downtown along 5th Avenue, Sloan's etching, oriented looking northward, offers a rebuttal of sorts. And I showed one example by Hopper that brought together a Parisian rooftop and the turmoil of the French Commune, but focus on the high spots of Paris was often visualized, perhaps most often, in association with revolutionary activity. For example, these two prints from the 1830s depict violence during the July Revolution, which ousted Charles X and replaced him with Louis Philippe. Notice the silhouetted figures hacking with pickaxes on the roof in the image at right. Might this model for taking and holding a structure founded in upheaval and social unrest possibly be relevant to arch conspirators? It's not that Sloan was aware of these precise examples, but rather that there was a pervasive visual tradition that connected the assault on rooftops or arches with circulating and toppling barricades, with times of crisis in governance, with challenges to authority, with more generally seeking freedom from restrictions. That Sloan invited Duchamp, a French artist, along makes the resonance across national boundaries all the more intriguing. Consider also the way the episode was related in the New York Tribune in 1923, an article heavily quoting Sloan. The martial overtones are clear from the second paragraph, which compares the plotters to shades of gallant soldiers who once did shoulder upon this ground. The author mentions avoiding policemen on duty, called blue-coated, quoting Sloan, quote, solemnly and in the manner befitting the seriousness of the occasion, we ascended to the highest point of vantage within the open space of the square. Sloan calls the point of assembly the roof, as well as the ramparts, using the term for the defensive barrier of a walled city. All of this for the purpose of making, quote, demands of the state. And it's true, as Michael Lobel writes, Gertrude Dirk may be the focus of the seated figures because of the light cast on her. They are seated in exchange with Duchamp, and she's typically credited with hatching the idea for the escapade. But I wonder what it might mean to instead consider how Sloan takes up the most space, and to think of him, although outside the circle, as Lobel observes, as more independent rather than supplicating, the only one whose whole body we see, and the only figure not eating, the only figure not huddled around the fire, to think of him as the purveyor of provisions, the keeper of the flame, the most vigilant one here, the only one not engrossed in conversation and consumption. He is the more active than the rest of the group. In short, he depicts himself as a kind of instigator or organizer. In light of this, I want to see the etching and the storming of the Washington Arch rooftop as a kind of fiercer critique of militarism and imperialism than is generally acknowledged as a more pronounced expression of Sloan's commitment to radical politics. As such, this is an attempt by reading here to sort of enrich, however modestly, Lobel's recent assertion that, quote, for all its apparent merriment, the festive assembly atop the arch echoed the darker tone of the times. Apprehending less obvious French debts in these etchings allows us to appreciate anew the ongoing cultural reciprocity between Paris and New York, adding to the way Paris existed in the American imagination in these decades. These scenes are like conduits exhuming layers not just across time, but also across distant locations. In a sense, they belong to the broader transfer of cultural prestige from Paris to New York, what's frequently regarded as the gradual shift of artistic modernity from Paris to New York, the idea that after Paris, New York was the world's second metropolis, as John Dos Passos wrote in the 20s. In revealing some traces and fragments of the 19th century into the 20th, who better to quote than Walter Benjamin, a great writer of urban spaces, on this feature of modernity, quote, the 19th century is the set of noises that invades our dream and which we interpret an awakening. Perhaps in these works, at least, it was also so for Hopper and for Sloan. Thank you.